to tackle the pandemic, but they patently aren't being allocated and distributed equitably across the world. We saw 2020 as a year of great scientific success in producing these tools. And really then the baton was passed to the politicians and the companies to make sure that these were allocated across the world. But as the UN Secretary General said on the 16th of January this year, that the science is succeeding, but the solidarity is failing. And unfortunately, in 2021, we've developed this two-track pandemic, whereby countries in Europe and many wealthy countries are having 70% coverage rates, but in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, coverage is less than 5%. And this potentially has disastrous consequences for the world. In terms of latest figures, I understand WHO are saying that next year alone, this might result in 5 million excess deaths and could cost the world economy $5.3 trillion by 2026. Now, we've known this situation for a while, and last year's G20 didn't really deal with this issue. It was an online event, and you might say they had the excuse that they didn't know these tools were going to be available in such quantities. But this year at the G7 held in Cornwall, the leaders had an opportunity to act on this, but there were only very modest allocations of vaccines permitted, and we haven't even seen those promises delivered on. So now again, the baton has passed to the G20 leaders who are meeting in Rome at the end of this week, Saturday, Sunday. And the big question is, will the G20 act to ensure a more equitable allocation, not only of vaccines, but of therapeutics and diagnostic tests as well? So we have an eminent panel with us today to discuss this issue. And our event today is going to be on the record, so it's not going to be following the famous Chatham House rule. In fact, we quite encourage people to recount what has been said today and tweet and share all this information around the world. And we're also recording this event. We would also like you to participate. And so we're asking for audience members to ask questions through the Q&A function, and which you'll see at the bottom of your screen. And my colleagues will collate questions and send them to me. And the most popular ones we'll try and ask in the time available. In a moment, we're going to have a short video by the former Prime Minister of the UK, Gordon Brown, who's been very active in this space and trying to encourage greater vaccine equity. But I'll very briefly introduce the panel as well, who will be speaking directly after the video by Gordon Brown. And the first speaker is going to be Dr. Ayode Alakija, who is the co-chair of the African Union African Vaccine Delivery Alliance and also founder of the Emergency Coordination Center in Nigeria. We'll then hear from WHO and specifically from Bruce Aylward, who is the senior advisor to the Director General on organizational change, but is also coordinating the ACT Accelerator on behalf of WHO. And finally, we're delighted to have with us, and I hope audio permitting, Gayle Smith. And Gayle is the coordinator for the Global COVID Response and Health Security at the Department of State for the Government of the United States of America. So without any further ado, I'd like to ask our colleagues to show the video from Gordon Brown, if we may, and then we'll go into the discussions.
It's unfortunately no exaggeration to say that this week's G20 summit is a life and death matter. And I want to thank Chatham House for the dedicated work in recent times and today in bringing the issues that the G20 will discuss to the forefront. Others today will speak more eloquently and with more information than I have on the issue of vaccine patents and technology transfer. And I wish them well in the campaigns that are underway. But I want to highlight what more can be done immediately to transfer unused vaccines from the global north, where they're stockpiled, to the global south, who need them urgently if vaccines are to win the race against the virus. Now, in the last few months, manufacturing production has ramped up from 500 million vaccines a month and trebled to 1.5 billion a month, with 2 billion likely to be produced every month from December onwards. In other words, 12 billion vaccines will have been manufactured by this year's end, enough for every adult to be fully vaccinated in the world. We have seen the future. A vaccinated world is possible, but it's not being distributed fairly. And people will ask why, if we can undertake and cannot undertake this relatively straightforward task to distribute vaccines equitably, how can we solve other problems the world faces? Because it's inexcusable that only 2% of low-income countries are vaccinated, only 5% of African adults. And sadly, when vaccines have become available that can immunize the whole world, vaccine nationalism and medical protectionism have moved center stage. For what's holding us back is not a lack of vaccines now, it's a lack of solidarity. We were 200 million vaccines short of meeting the September target of 10% vaccination in the 91 countries that should have benefited from the distribution. And even now, 40% of health workers are unvaccinated across the world, only 10% in Africa. We are now 500 million vaccines short of meeting the December 40% target for adult vaccination. Affinity, the data research agency, says there are over 200 million vaccines stockpiled in the West today. That's more than has been administered to date on the entire African continent. What is troubling is that this figure will only rise, and there could be 1 billion unused vaccines at the turn of the year in Europe and America alone. And what Affinity have shown us in their research is that if these vaccines continue to be hoarded, 100 million of them may by December pass their use-by date and therefore go to waste. To have and to hoard vaccines in one part of the world and to deny them to another part would be the greatest failure of international cooperation in peacetime. Because not only are tens of thousands of lives at stake if people remain unvaccinated, but the cost of all this is an already unequal world becoming even more unequal between the vaccinated rich and the unvaccinated poor. Because if we know that 100,000 lives and more have been saved in the UK by administering around 100 million vaccines, how many more lives could be saved across the world by administering these unused vaccines over the next few months? Now, when the G20 meets on Saturday, it has the power to decide who is vaccinated and therefore protected, and who is not, and whose lives continue to be at risk. For while COVAX is the global bulk purchasing agency doing its best to get vaccines out to the rest of the world, it is not COVAX, but G20 leaders who control the supply of vaccines. 89% of vaccines delivered so far have been to G20 countries, and still 71% of future delivery contracts are scheduled to go to the G20 nations. The G20 leaders could today take decisive action by releasing and swapping their vaccine contracts to COVAT or to AVAT, the African agency, so that they can deliver vaccines to the populations that need them. Now, vaccination is the best tool. And of course, some countries will need assistance on the ground to effectively get the shots into arms. But developing countries also have limited access to basic treatments such as medical oxygen. And not only do we have the new therapeutic interventions that are being denied to Africa and elsewhere, but we are still doing too little basic testing. Of more than 3 billion tests worldwide, less than half of 1% have been performed in low-income countries. Your chance of getting a test 80 times greater in a high-income country than in a low-income country. And this is one reason why the world's high-income countries meeting in the G20 must respond to this week's Act A appeal for the resources to end these shameful inequalities. And we must never let ourselves believe that COVID was a black swan event that will never be repeated. We must be better prepared for any future crisis. And that means Africa and low-income countries must themselves be empowered to become vaccine producers, and that means technology transfer, it means licensing agreements, it means patent waivers, and it also means, as the Summers, Thurman and Ngozi and Monti reports have argued, we need to have a global pandemic preparedness board of health and finance ministers, and perhaps 10 billion a year at least to build the infrastructure necessary to strengthen our global health security, to prevent pandemics and to prepare for them in the future. This weekend, the G20 can start to address these fundamental inequalities across our world. An immediate airlift of the 200 million or so unused vaccines stockpiled by the countries in the West, followed by 300 million airlifted with the help of other G20 countries, would make good the 500 million shortfall so that we can achieve a 40% December target for vaccination. But only the G20 can do this, only by combining our forces, only by showing, as we've done in the past, that the real enemy we face is not one another, but disease, poverty, and inequality. And if we can do so, we can save many of the 5 million lives that today hang in the balance.
Thank you. Very powerful words, which I think are echoed in a piece that Gordon Brown has written, an open letter, in fact, from a number of former world leaders and Nobel laureates to the Italian Prime Minister, who is the chair of the G20, which you can find in Project Syndicate. So they're very easy to find on the web, and I think explains that again very well. So we heard the views of Gordon Brown there. That I'm very keen to hear, Yodi, your perspective from the African Union on the front line, you know, and a continent that is being deprived of vaccines at the moment. Were the G20 to be sort of tuning in today to our meeting, what would you like to say to them in terms of ending the pandemic more quickly, specifically thinking about the African continent?
Thank you very much, Robin. It's a delight and an honor to be here with you all today. I think the Right Honourable Gordon Brown pretty much said it all. You know, he laid it out very clearly, but let me come at you from the perspective of one who is from the actual global south, from one of the people who has been left behind, from the continent where we are saying, where are the vaccines? And I loved what you said at the beginning about talking about the political economy of this situation, because I think for too long we have dealt with this as a health crisis. It is not a health crisis. It is a political crisis. It is an economic crisis. It is an education crisis. It is more and more becoming a humanitarian crisis in most parts of the world. And so we have pigeonholed it in the little pigeonhole of health. We have put an enormous burden on the shoulders of my brother Tedros and Bruce and others like them, and we have made them the sole sort of arbiters of what is done in this pandemic. But that is wrong. The world has gotten this wrong. So I speak also now directly, as you said at the beginning, speak to the G20. I say to the G20, I say it is time to act. I say enough is enough. I say that we've done enough talking. It is time to actually move. What we need the world to do, as the Right Honourable Gordon Brown just said, what we need the world to do is to bring the same energy that we brought to the evacuation of Kabul. I couldn't believe watching that when Afghanistan was falling, when all of that was going on, and the airlifts and the countries cooperating. We had global cooperation and solidarity then. Where is it today? Was it because in that case there was a perceived baddie element, the Taliban, the Islamists who were going to affect lives of those who we had already gone to try and save, and therefore we had to save face? Do we not have a common humanity? It is time to act. It is time to stop speaking. We need to build on the excellent work that was done at that once, you know, the high-level summit that was convened by President Joe Biden during UNGA. That was wonderful. It was a G20 summit, but I would say that it didn't go far enough. We need to bring everybody around the table. We need to have a more general global heads of state summit, as has been just recommended by the GPMB, the Global Pandemic Monitoring Board. And I was just at the Berlin Summit, World Health Summit, where I participated in that, and there were some great recommendations. But you know what? We've heard those recommendations before. I'm tired of hearing the same thing over and over again. We don't need leaders to go to Rome and to go and repeat the same thing. We want them to tell us the how. How are they going to do it, and the when? We need a massive airlift. We need to get jabs from ports into arms. We need to stop hearing the excuses that we hear all the time, which tell us that, you know, oh, well, Africans are not going to use the vaccines, and that's why we're worried about giving it to them. That is the most patriarchal, paternalistic, patronizing thing that I think I have ever heard. Somebody said it to me in Berlin yesterday, and I quite literally had to leave the room so that I wouldn't be put in some sort of jail for assault. I was so furious. How do you tell me that I'm not, it's like telling your child, you're not going to get your pudding, your dessert, your cheesecake or whatever until you have eaten your main meal. That is not a call for G20 to make. Their call to make is to do what humanity desires in this moment, and that is to save lives. This is not a developmental issue. My other point is that I'm worried that we're dealing with this as a global community as a development issue. We're dealing with it as how we deal with routine immunization, how we deal with education. But no, this is an emergency issue. We need the emergency managers. And I think part of where we've gone wrong is that, in Gavi dealing with it as they dealt with routine immunizations, we have left the OFDAs, for instance, of the US government out of the room. We need the crazy people in here. We need the emergency managers of the world, those who will parachute into places and get jabs into people's arms, bring the diagnostics, bring the oxygen, bring the monoclonal antibodies, whatever is needed. This is not an issue just for those who deal with, day-to-day business. I ask often, where are the Joanne Lieus of this world who did an incredible job as president of Médecins Sans Frontières? Those are the people we need managing this crisis. We need those with guts. We need those who will speak truth to power. And we need the global leaders to listen to the voices of the Yodis and the others of this world who are saying our lives are literally on the line. And it is not just that you're trying to save African lives. There is an enlightened self-interest to this, because if we do not deal with this pandemic right now, well, I think already we might be too late. We have the AY 4.2 variant. My daughter jokes about that. My first initials of my name are AY. She goes, oh my God, God help the world. Hurricane Mama is coming. The new variant is going to be called Yodi. It is going to take us over. We don't know what is coming next. It is in our enlightened self-interest as a global community to deal with this now. So I appeal to the G20. You need greater inclusivity. You need to call voices in from the global south who understand how things work. You cannot work on the assumption of, the same old, same old. We don't even know where this pathogen came from. We're dealing with COVID, we're dealing with climate. Both of those things are both sides of the same coin, and we need the fierce urgency of now. We need them to bring financing to the table. We need them to bring financing to pandemic preparedness, but also to ending this pandemic in the individual countries. And we also need them to bring the African leaders, to hold them into the room and bring them together and also hold them to account. We need wider global accountability on this issue, and we need it immediately. Thank you.
Fantastic, Eugene. I couldn't agree more about this. Yeah, exactly, being a political issue. And I think more and more people are saying this, and it came out very clearly before the World Bank meetings last week, where you had the IMF, the World Bank, WHO, WTO, rock solid, all saying the same things. And, that hasn't been always the case when it's come to health and health financing issues, but singing as one and really saying, where is the political leadership to deal with this? So if I can maybe sort of turn to Bruce, but perhaps before I do, just to remind colleagues that you have the opportunity to ask questions of our panel. And please do post your questions in the Q&A session. And if you ask a particularly good question, then people will vote for it with the thumbs up thing, and your question will go to the top and have a better chance of being asked. And in fact, we can even invite you on mic to ask your question if you give us, if you indicate that you'd like to do so. So Bruce, if I can turn to you now, the WHO have been championing universal health coverage and really sort of taking this into the political arena, particularly Dr. Tedros and yourself and Mike Ryan, who I think joined our Pre-G7 event and spoke passionately about this. We've moved on a few months now, but really not that much has changed, has it? So I'm just wondering what your perspective is on what we can do to get the G20 to take this more seriously.
Thanks, Robert, and to you and Chatham House for bringing us together for this conversation today, because there is an extraordinary urgency that I think Gordon and Yodi have communicated. But I want to just come back to the question you asked. If I were sitting across from those leaders, the things I would say, there's three key points I would make. The first is the urgency of the challenge and the consequences if we don't. And on that point, remember, we had a very modest goal. Let's vaccinate 10% of the world's population in all countries by the end of September. 56 countries missed it for want of only 200 million doses of vaccine. That's 4 days of global production that we could not get into COVAX. We are now looking at our next goal, which is the 40% target by the end of September or December. That was set way back in May when everyone said completely doable, as was September goal wasn't ambitious enough. So here we are 2 months out from that. We are 500 million doses and 80 countries off track. So remember, when we went to the G20 and said this 10 days ago, we said between now and when you meet, enough doses will be made to get every country to 40% if you can get them to the right places. Everyone wants to say this is complicated. It isn't. It's simple. It's very simple math, as simple as it gets. So we are at risk of missing that. We're missing the testing target. We are at 13 per 100,000 people a day in low-income countries versus 700 in high-income, or even 100 in many low-middle-income countries. So the gap and the gulf is huge. It has real consequences, I would remind them. 5 million people will die. You will not see most of those deaths, so you can sleep easy if you want to, but 5 million more will die in the next 12 months. The economy will lose $5.3 trillion over the next 5 years. It's very simple if we cannot close this staggering equity gap. And the people meeting this weekend can solve that problem. Now, the second thing I would highlight to them is the solution. There is a solution. The ACT Accelerator and its COVAX arm was designed 18 months ago because we saw this problem coming. Dr. Tedros, other international leaders saw it coming. We got together with some great countries and leaders to put this thing together with the goal of accelerating development of these tools and their equitable distribution. Now, for all the press out there, COVAX works. Every dose it gets out within 24, 48 hours, sometimes a little longer. It moves super fast. It's gotten over 425 million doses out to 104 countries, but it doesn't make vaccines. Companies that make vaccines and countries that control the supply have got to cooperate for COVAX to be successful. That was the deal we had last year. That's the deal that people have not stuck to. So the solution exists. We can do bilateral deals and other things, but that won't get you to equity because that does not, even it across countries, which the COVAX facility and the ACT Accelerator do. So we've got an integrated end-to-end solution, proven it can get into 144 of the most complex countries in the world. It's got a big partner footprint in every one of those countries to help deal with the barriers that are there, and that high-income countries and manufacturers are making more difficult by making the supply so complicated. Stop, start, stop, start. That is how you frig up an immunization program. So now we're tying both arms behind the back, the supply arm and then the security of supply arm. So then when we get to the last point, and I want to make a point, sorry, Robert, on how important the COVAX is and the ACT Accelerator. 80% of the vaccines that low-income countries do have come from COVAX. 33%, a third of the vaccine that's going into low middle income countries is coming through COVAX. So this is it's the dominant supplier for these areas, crucial piece of the solution. 80% of the tests that are done in the majority of low income countries come from COVAX, from our diagnostics pillar, so they rely on it. So last point I wanted to make is the solution. So there is a solution, it's at risk of being moved. As of yesterday, the G20 was having trouble agreeing that the targets should be the fantastic ones that Gayle, you championed, and President Biden got out there, our targets of 70% coverage in every country and 40% in every country by end of this year. They had trouble agreeing on that, let alone agreeing on the fact that they would move doses more quickly, et cetera, to solve. So what do they need to do? First of all, commit to the new plan that we are launching at 4 o'clock this afternoon by the Director General and the Prime Minister of Norway and President Ramaphosa, the new ACT Accelerator plan. Get behind, endorse it. Commit to helping finance it because we have to finance the pieces. There's a financing gap around the tests and treatments, et cetera. Commit to accelerating dose donations and delivery swaps. Even more importantly, get out of the way in the queue. And there's been a fantastic deal just done. The US is just doing a deal right now with AVAX, so it proves it can be done. So to help get those folk the doses, and then take stock. Let's commit to take stock every month. Where are we on reaching these equity goals? Who is doing what? Who has to do more? Publish it. Make sure everyone can see it. Commit to doing our part. So what we need in 2 days is that commitment. On the piece of paper right now, the statement that will come out, it does not say those things. It says only one of them. We commit and we say there should be more access. But the G20 controls access. It controls supply, controls financing that will solve this. So we need those commitments, not just a commitment to access, because everybody's committed to that. What we need is the action.
Thanks very much, Bruce. Yes, that is very disappointing to hear if that's what the communique is sort of saying at the moment, because that's precious little different to the meeting last year in Riyadh. I mean, basically, it means nothing's happened in a year. And yes, it's very easy to talk up. Everyone says we believe in access. I think one of the mRNA manufacturers has gone on record as saying that the equity is their North Star, which, to be perfectly frank, is laughable when you think about it.
Robert, these are great people that are meeting this weekend. They've got 48 hours.
They have.
The right thing.
Amazing things can happen in 48 hours. And you've already referred to the leadership shown by President Biden in the run up to the UNGA in bringing the world together and setting these targets and beginning to fill the political vacuum, I think, that there has been over the previous 18 months or so. So no better person to talk to than Gayle now to ask about the US's approach to this and how things have potentially sort of changed with the new administration. Gayle, I hope we can hear from you now. We had a few audio issues earlier on, so fingers crossed. Okay. But it sounded good.
Here we go. Can you hear me? I'm on the phone.
Yes, we can. Yes, so please give us your views.
Okay, thank you very much, and greetings to everybody. I am the one, there's always at least one that has massive technical difficulties at one of these events, and so I was going to have to mime my entire set of remarks, but thankfully we found a way for me to communicate. Let me just say a couple things, and I want to do a quick plug to something that Bruce just mentioned, because I think it's quite significant. And Bruce, you mentioned the deal with Avant, where I think we were a facilitator. And I think, look, on the part of the United States, we've now shipped well over 200 million. We're shipping doses every day. We've bought 1 billion doses that are going through COVAX. We will continue to share doses on top of that. So we've got quite a rhythm going. But I think one of the things I'm quite proud of that we were able to announce recently is Moderna is a major producer, as you know. It's a desired vaccine. We were able to work with Moderna and with Avant, which I will give the good doctor a lot of credit. It's a pretty extraordinary enterprise that's been built in Africa by Africa to buy vaccines. So yes, there is a hope and an aspiration that the wealthy countries will contribute vaccines, but there's also a determination to get out there on the market and buy them. And as Avant has said, it's not always been easy out there on the market to compete. So we were just able to work with Avant and Moderna on a deal that will bring, with the option, 110 million addition vaccines. And that's the kind of thing I think we all need to be able to do. If we can buy doses, let's buy doses. 1 billion doses of Pfizer. Share doses on a regular basis, but also get in there and work with our partners to make sure that these deals can be done. I want to go to some of what's been said, two key points. One, I think, Yodi, you made a really good point at the beginning that the world has defined this as a health emergency. And of course it's a health emergency, but it is not a singular health emergency that should just be left to the health people to figure out. As you rightly point out, we've got shadow pandemics, whether they are political, whether they are economic, both on the ground and at the macro level. We've got a food security pandemic. We've got all sorts of shadow pandemics operating behind us. And one of the things that we're very intent upon is, while not obscuring that it is a health emergency, making clear that this is also a global security crisis. Now, what we are trying to do with the summit, and our goal there was quite deliberate. I think President Biden felt very strongly that the world really needs to come together with more urgency. You can't just do that in one summit. So we were setting the stage. The summit, as some of you have heard, set out some really, really ambitious targets, and that was deliberate. They are ambitious targets, but as Bruce has noted, it's doable. We can meet those targets. Number two, we also announced that accountability and tracking and being transparent is going to need to be a key part of this. And many of us have been working together with ACT-A and the Multilateral Task Force and others so that there will be both a common baseline, a source of data for everybody that's using the same data, but a publicly available tracking of where the world is on meeting those targets, because we've got to hold ourselves accountable, and we've got to stare in the face of what progress we've made and what progress is yet to be made. But what we also announced is that this is to be the first of a series of events. So we've had the summit. The G20 summit is coming up. That's a critically important benchmark. The Secretary of State will be convening foreign ministers. I think that's absolutely key. Foreign ministers, imagine if foreign ministers had been meeting on a regular basis since the onset of the pandemic. Well, that's what we've got to get moving now. And there will be another summit after the first of the year. And that is a really critical action forcing event, because we've got the targets, we've got the intervening events, we've got the transparency and the visibility on the targets. And our hope and aspiration is that that will galvanize and drive countries to work together and get there. In closing, let me just say a couple of things on the vaccine side. Supply is absolutely key, and equity of supply. I think we've heard some of the most eloquent and passionate articulations of that I have ever heard. But, and this is something Bruce mentioned, one of the biggest challenges is that we don't have clarity on the schedule of supply. So for COVAX or for anyone else, not knowing what is coming in the pipeline and when puts them at a disadvantage. It is also unhelpful to the countries that are going to be receiving these vaccines, because they need advance notice in order to plan and deliver. We're trying to work on that, urging our allies and friends that are also have made commitments to sharing doses to provide a regular schedule. We've got a schedule for the Pfizer doses so people know what is coming when. And then the second thing is the shots in arms. Look, I live in the United States, and the U.S. government had to put on a whole extra campaign on top of normal vaccine programs here to get to the levels of vaccination coverage we've gotten to. So one of the things we just also have to be mindful of, and I would remind people to bear in mind, whether you're advocating, whether you're speaking, is that we need to make sure that the resources to turn vaccines into vaccinations are commensurate with the flow of vaccinations. That's absolutely critical, because the last thing we need is to be in a circumstance where we can't deliver, or countries can't deliver the vaccines they need. Let me close there. I'm really eager to hear people's questions and comments, and thanks to all the technical people who helped make me make my audio work. Thanks.
Marvelous. Thank you very much, Gayle. And I think that you've managed to answer the first question you were just about to be asked, actually. So that was very intuitive about this issue of turning vaccines into vaccinations and the supply side constraints and delivery constraints in countries. Yodi, I can see that you've got your hand up. Did you want to respond there? I can see you have your hand up there.
I'm on mute. I wanted to, yes, thank you. No, Gayle, thank you very much. And also to Bruce, just something very quickly to what Gayle said about the summit. We had this conversation at the World Health Summit in Berlin that I was at yesterday, just yesterday, actually managed to attend in person. And what was painful was the fact that I was one of the very few brown or black faces around. And I pointed this out in my intervention and said to them that the reason for this is because most of our countries, people cannot attend because they don't have vaccines. People cannot attend because they cannot fulfill the criteria. But so to speak to what Gayle said, I mean, this is a pitch, and I announced this actually at Berlin yesterday when everyone was talking about the next summit. And I said, well, who are you all waiting for? I mean, there was no US government representative there, what have you, but everyone was bouncing these ideas around. And I said, we are the ones we're waiting for. We all just need to get up and do this. And I put my hand up and said that the Global South also needs to host the next summit. And I offered to host it in Abuja, in Nigeria, because we need to stop going to Geneva or to New York or to DC or wherever for these summits. If we're going to have a summit to talk about us, there's a saying in my language, you cannot shave my head in my absence. I need to be there for you shave my head. I need to actually, so yesterday we're all talking about vaccine equity and diagnostics and therapeutics. There's nobody there from the global south except myself and a few sort of privileged others. So that is my pitch back to Gayle, in that, I said this to Tedros yesterday and to Jeremy Farrar and to many others that were there. And I said, Yodi will work with you all to bring this to the African continent. Obviously it's most convenient which in the biggest African country, but we have to do this. The second thing is around the issue of vaccinations. Vaccines, I call it ports to arms. I lead the Africa Vaccine Delivery Alliance, which is the delivery side of VAT that Gayle is speaking to, which is called AVDA. I don't work for the Africa Union. I'm not a staff member. I'm a pro bono, concerned human being, citizen, daughter of the continent who wants to see things change. And what we've been talking about from the very beginning is that we need to get these vaccines from ports into people's arms, jabs into arms, as they call them in the UK. For that, we need concentrated campaigns, concerted campaigns. We need mass vaccinations, and we need assistance to do that. That's why I talk about the humanitarian type nature of this initiative. We need to bring in the humanitarians. We need to bring in those who, be it ICRC, I'm also, of course, former chief humanitarian coordinator of Nigeria. So half of my country, quite frankly, right now is almost in conflict. How are you even going to get there if you don't have ICRC, if you don't have Médecins Sans Frontières? This is a massive logistical and humanitarian and political effort. And we need to get our heads into that mindset. It is not like getting vaccines at Rite Aid or at Boots in the UK or wherever else you get it from the different countries. It is so different. And that's why the political economy, which Rob referred to earlier, is so critical. Because if you don't have an analysis of the local political economy, you're not going to understand how to work this. And you're going to be flying blind. We need you, Gayle. We need you, Bruce, who does regularly, and others. We need you to work with us, who understand how this works on the continent, to understand. Australia and Fiji just had a very, very, very successful vaccination rollout campaign because they understand each other. And the last thing about a VAT and buying of vaccines is that, Gayle, most countries have to take loans to buy these vaccines. So there is also that. So most countries are looking to COVAX. I can't agree enough with Bruce, who's going to fall off his chair in a moment, when I say that COVAX is absolutely essential to all of us. We need it to work. It was failing because the countries were not providing it with the vaccines they needed. And there were also some governance issues. Those are being fixed. We hope it'll be more inclusive going forward, but COVAX must work. COVAX cannot be allowed to fail because COVAX is the hope of most of the world. There aren't many countries like Nigeria who can afford to buy vaccines. Even Nigeria at this moment can ill afford it. So yes, the deals with Moderna and the visibility you mentioned, Gayle, is the other issue. We have bought vaccines, 400, 200 million from Johnson & Johnson. Today, as I speak to you, less than 10 million have been delivered in Africa. So where are they? So why are countries taking loans to purchase vaccines from J&J or from Moderna when they're not going to see them until 2026? So these are the issues for us, looking from our perspective, that need to be dealt with. And I won't get into debt and special drawing rights. We need targeted financial interventions, and we need G20 also to agree that so that we can help countries. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And Bruce, do you want to sort of come back? I can say I love interaction with the panel. So both Bruce and Gayle, if you can be brief, and then I'll bring in our questioners. Oh, you're muted, Bruce.
Yeah, it's important we hear the questions that the audience need answered, because we need these folk out advocating for this. We have 48 hours to get the right language and the right commitments in place. But there's one really seductively attractive excuse not to share doses, and that is that the countries can't absorb it. And what Gayle said about that was so important, and Yodi, right? So we've looked at this. There's 82 countries who cannot get enough vaccine. We're missing about 500 million doses, right? 10 days of global production. And now of those 82, 55 of them are supply constrained. So let's put it in perspective. There's only 24 that actually have an absorptive issue. These are fragile, vulnerable, conflict-affected countries that have challenges with everything. So, Africa is no such thing as Africa. There's, a continent of 50 plus countries, or at least the AU constitution, that, are so diverse. And if we look at the numbers again, those 55 countries, that's 1.5 billion people. The other 24, that's 500 million. So 75% of these unreached are in places that you had a great couple of comments in there from Marianne and others in the Q&A saying, it's a trickle of vaccines getting into countries, and we're asking them to be prepared. Well, if they want to be prepared, they have to have supply security. They have to know what's coming. And to Gayle's point, manufacturers will not tell me how much vaccine we will get next month through COVAX. We cannot tell countries how much you're going to get, but we're asking the president of that country to stand up and say, everybody be ready for the vaccines that are about to arrive. You can't do it. So we need supply security and visibility. Manufacturers come clean, like play ball for 6 months, right? The second thing we need is money in those countries so they can hire the surge workforce that's got to help deal with logistic problem, deal with hesitancy, deal with all these other problems. But that takes time to get them trained. You can't drop the vaccine on last second, right? We need the banks to step up and really move the grant financing in the highly indebted countries, et cetera. And the emergency ops and the rest of it, these countries can do it. I helped run Ebola in West Africa. Wow, these countries are way better at it than I was, like Yodi says, right? Africa CDC saved my freaking life in that mess. And they were fabulous, as were the national leaders in those countries. They're incredible. Man, when they had the tools, they just took off. And what we've got to do is do not fall in the seductive trap of saying they can't absorb it. That is so dangerous. And
couldn't agree more, Bruce.
Did we see the high-income countries absorb it at the beginning? What a mess we made in our rollouts, right? Let's be honest.
Gayle, do you want to come in on this point?
Yeah, actually, I think our time is shrinking, and I want to make sure we can hear questions that we've got. So I'll pass.
Oh, okay. Thanks very much, Gayle. You might be sort of fielding part of the first question anyway, actually, from so if we can bring Toby on. I think his question is around strengthening supply systems. So Toby, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you very much to everybody. It's a fairly basic question, and we're talking a lot about the political will to talk about getting vaccines, but it seems a shame that nobody's talking about the actual operational part of getting vaccinations. And it seems to be a huge worry that there's no attention on the actual equipment that is going to be needed to do all this, including the equipment in terms of the trained nurses and healthcare workers. But my issue is actually we don't have enough syringes, and therefore the vaccines will rot in their vials.
So supply and demand issues, delivery. Bruce.
I just want to jump in on this because Toby, we got to make sure people are armed with the right information, like you say. Last October, every single country of the 82 or 91, pardon me, AMC countries developed a national vaccine deployment plan. It included the logistics, the cold chain, communications requirements. There were 9 major elements. When we found there were still problems in it, we completely redid the entire exercise, building in better financing and other elements. So we have to be very careful to say there's no attention being given to it. Massive attention being given to it on the ground. Is it getting financed? No. Is it getting supply behind it to make it work? No. Is it getting alignment among the partners to actually make it successful? No. These are self-fulfilling prophecies of a failure to be able to deliver these vaccines. Back in history, I ran, the polio eradication program, went into countries in sub-Saharan Africa that had virtually no infrastructure. Now, there's a completely different ballgame, but man, they went out and vaccinated 80, 90% of their kids in weeks. And this is more complicated. This is injectables, this is adults, et cetera. So we started months in advance, not weeks, to be ready this time. And they're working to get ready. There's going to be problems, but there is attention being given to it. But it won't work without the financing, without the vaccines, without the security of supply. They don't know if they're going to get any vaccines. Why buy a fridge?
Yeah, great. Thank you. Another sort of hot topic, and I think if we can bring Amanda on, who's got a question. So yeah, Amanda, fire away. You just unmute yourself there. Hi, Amanda. If you could just click on the little microphone at the bottom left, hopefully the cross will disappear from it and you'll unmute.
Whilst we're waiting for Amanda, I'll just say very quickly, I mean, in addition to what Bruce just said, that it is absolutely critical that people understand that African countries have been doing this without problems for years. You know, I mean, I ran a cholera vaccination campaign. We vaccinated 1 million people in 10 days. So this is not the issue. The issue is, but the syringe issue is a good point. Amanda, you're waiting?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think that I'm going to have to sort of try and find her question. Here we go. Yeah. So it's about TRIPS waivers, and obviously during the summer we had the sort of dramatic news that the President Biden would support a TRIPS waiver. So interested particularly here Gayle's view on this. But what are your positions on the negotiations for a TRIPS waiver at the WTO in the context of the G20 meeting? Would it not be crucial if the G20 supported the proposal from India and South Africa in order to achieve more sustainable vaccine production now and in the future? So the hot issue of patent waivers. Yeah, Gayle, would you like to kick off on that?
Sure. And let me just say a couple things. And just quickly to Toby on syringes, that's a good flag. It's something we and our partners, including in UNICEF and others, are working on very diligently, because you're absolutely right. There is congestion in the supply chain for syringes. And again, it's not dissimilar to what we're seeing in some other areas. But thanks for flagging, because it's really critical. Look, the United States supported a temporary TRIPS waiver, and I think some were surprised that we supported it. As the president, our U.S. trade representative, said at the time, this is an extraordinary moment in history, and it demands extraordinary measures. Those negotiations, as many of you know, are really complicated. They are all members. They are text negotiations. It's going on as we speak, and we'll see where they come out. I think that what's important out of this debate and discussion is it brings forward two things. It's how do we make sure that in future pandemics, we've got scenarios where we do not repeat what's happened this time, right? We've got to have a better system than this. And then second, it gets to production. And I think it's important to realize two things. It's very vital to build new facilities and invest in new facilities. Our Development Finance Corporation is out there actively doing that with the IFC and others. But it's vaccines, and it is the consumables, the ingredients that are in vaccines. It's the things like syringes. There are a number of things that we need to increase global production of and diversify geographic production of. And it's, by the way, it's also a good thing for a lot of the world, because it's also an investment in jobs and everything else. I'll stop there.
And maybe if I could sort of have a little follow-up, because just relating to another question that someone's asked about technology transfers and the extent to which, obviously, patent waivers is a part of that, but how seriously do you think the West is taking technology transfers to developing countries? We've heard talk about some companies setting up manufacturing plants in sub-Saharan Africa, but the pace does seem rather slow. So I don't know what your thoughts might be on how that can be accelerated, because obviously had we done this 18 months ago, we could be in a very different position now.
Well, we tried.
Yeah, I just say a couple things. There have been indications of intentions to set up plants in Africa, and we are very eager to see that happen and encouraging that happens as quickly as possible. I think on the one hand, it has to be as quickly as possible. On the other hand, they got to be smart investments. And there's got to be thinking done about, I mean, look, one of the interesting things I find is that every country I engage with wants an mRNA plant in his or country today.
Yeah.
And I get that. I'd like to have one like here in my office. But we've got to think about the global architecture for vaccine production is built to provide 5 billion vaccines. It's not built to surge. It is not built to do what we need it to do now or what we are likely going to need it to do in the future. Mm-hmm. So how do we think systematically about that? how do we think about, we need diversified geographical production. We need production in countries that can provide for their own citizens, but also export. So that you get broader regional coverage. We need to look at cost points. Moving these quickly, there are a lot of boxes to check. Again, this is also doable. It's not it's a relatively easy problem to sort out. I would simply advocate that this is one that needs collective, regional, global thinking about, to say, all right, world, how do we think about how we diversify production? How do we think about how we have a system that can surge and do what we need to do now? In the interim, the last point I'll make, the tech transfer mRNA plants, that's going to take time to occur. We would like to see progress on it. There are also other investments that can be made in vaccines, in testing, in therapeutics, and other things that could yield increased flow. So we've made a couple of those investments in existing facilities just to see if we can get production doubled and so on. So we shouldn't lose sight of that as also an option.
Great, thank you. Bruce, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, so first, does there need to be more distributed manufacturing? Absolutely. And does it have to be enabled? Absolutely. In a crisis like this, the one thing that manufacturers have proven is you need waivers. I mean, it wasn't our calling for it. They proved you need it, as plain as that. You know, where do you put these things? Folks, look at the map, right? Our World Data, Duke University, but look at the map. Look at the areas that are red and green and yellow in terms of vaccine coverage and say, what's the difference between the green place? It's not that they're rich or poor. They don't control the means of production and they have no control over supply. So you want to know where you put these, Robert, you put them in the red places and the yellow places, and you don't get too hung up. Like Gayle says, you got to move fast, right? Make decisions about where to get them to optimize. There's a couple of criteria: apply them fast and go. Then lean on the manufacturers, because you know what? The only thing you prove this time is you need waivers, unfortunately, because you ain't going to do it otherwise. And remember, Robert, this began, and everybody on the call, and Amanda, thanks for the question. You know, 4 months ago, 5 months ago, you can't put vaccine places in these countries because they haven't got the skill sets and capacities to do it. So then the US and others ratchet up pressure on manufacturers. All of a sudden, there's a whole bunch of places that can do it. Oh, but we haven't got enough capacity to supply and blah, blah, blah. And you ratchet up the pressure and you get past that one. We've wasted 12 months getting even here. Are there enough places? No, we're nowhere near where we need to be at. And the last thing I just mentioned, Robert, say you want to start making a vaccine. You go to the bank and you ask for a loan for the money to do it. The first thing they're going to say is, do you have access to the IP? No. That's the end of that. And then you go to a bunch of experts who actually know how to make the vaccine and say, can you come work with us? And they say, do you have access to the IP? They say, no. Well, you know what? We're not going to get sued by those companies and blacklisted and never work again, right? So there are so many barriers. And this is about just removing barriers to go fast, save lives, save an economy. You know what? There's a plan. We're going to launch it in 31 minutes. It says it costs $20 million, $1 billion. You know what? You're going to lose 4 times that by the end of November if you don't act on this kind of a plan and move these pieces and move these doses. Math is so simple.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks.
I think we've Robert, sorry, one last point. If the right decisions aren't made this week, the pandemic will last a year longer than it needs to, right? That's simple.
Yeah. That's a definite headline from this session. Thank you very much, Bruce. And one last question. I think we just squeeze one in from Arush Lal. If Arush could sort of, brilliant, perfectly timed. So Arush, if you could unmute and ask a question, please.
Sure. Thank you so much. I wanted to say, so I hear world leaders often discussing the issue of equity, but this is almost entirely framed as an LMIC versus high-income country issue, and it entirely overlooks equity within countries, which have just as much of an impact on universal vaccine coverage. The health systems connector of the ACT Accelerator has largely been sidelined and reduced to PPE delivery, while other kind of health systems components are often overlooked as well. And I think this largely distracts from the issue of in-country equity. How can COVAX better leverage its expertise and partners to ensure in-country equity and foundational health systems interventions necessary for vaccine delivery while maintaining other essential health services? Thank you.
Excellent question. Thank you very much, Arush. Yodi, would you like to answer, maybe thinking from an African perspective, maybe even Nigeria?
Well, I can answer from a global perspective just because I live on 3 different continents. And he makes a very, very good point. So let me start with Africa. Let me talk about the fact that, yes, Arush is absolutely correct, that vaccines arrive, but then it's due to the supply issue. Vaccines arrive in capital cities. It is the politicians, it is those with power who are the first to get vaccines. But that again is because it's simple economics, it's supply and demand. You know, that is not something COVAX can deal with. That is something we have to deal with ourselves. We cannot continue to tell the world to fix our own problems. So we also have to fix governance within our own countries. We have to fix inequity within our own countries. We have to fix the gap, and we have to fix our own health systems to ensure that things are more equitable within our own countries and within our own structures. I mean, I say I'll speak to it globally because I can also speak from the Pacific Islands angle, where there's been great more equity in terms of my other home, as many of you know, is Fiji. There's been a lot, just incredible rollout of vaccines in that country. And that also speaks to production, because AstraZeneca was being made in Australia. When Australians decided they didn't want the AstraZeneca vaccine, they pretty much gave, due to some great bilateral diplomacy between Australia and Fiji, they gave most of their AstraZeneca that was needed to Fiji. That country is now 97% first dose vaccinated. They got the vaccines out by horse, by boat, by drua. They vaccinated people. It proves that if you have vaccines, you will vaccinate people. And my final point is this. This is about power. Pure and simple. The internal inequity in countries is about power. The global inequity is about power. The voices of the global south, north, have completely drowned out the voices of the global south, because it is a power dynamic that is causing this. This pandemic is, and what we're seeing down the line is about power. I loved what Gayle said about the other hidden, or I forget your exact terminology, I wrote it down, I wanted to steal it. Pandemics, that was the one. About shadow pandemics. Talk about the shadow pandemic about gender and young women who have been forced into marriage, who have been forced out of education, whose lifetime earnings are in the trillions that will be lost. But also, let's talk about how we fix this and how G20 fix this. We need a 10-year plan going forward. This thing is not going to end tomorrow. Whether we get all the vaccines we need next week or not, the vaccinations will not be able to be rolled out. So I disagree with Bruce, very rarely I do this, but I disagree with him that it's going to last an extra year. I think this pandemic is going on for another 2 years because of a lack of action. And so leaders of the G20, let me end on them again. They need to take this seriously. If they want their economies, again, self-interest. I said last week, I think on BBC, that it is political suicide for any politician not to want to vaccinate the whole world as equitably as possibly and as quickly as possible, because of the variants that are coming back, because their countries are going to have to go back into repeated cycles of shutdown and lockdowns, whether they like it or not. We can pretend it's over for those of you in the West who are going to the theatre and to the football and to what have you, and for those of us in this global South who are still, having to huddle down. But it is not over, and it's not over until we take care of our fellow citizens. This crisis is a time to shift that balance of power, and we have to take that opportunity. And we welcome and are thankful to those of you who understand this in this moment and realize that this is an existential crisis for the world. Gayle says it's a human security issue. It's a peace and security issue for Africa, as we're beginning to see uprisings and riots and what have you across the continent. It's a global security problem, and we have to deal with it. And we need leaders to grow up, really, quite frankly. And we're grateful President Biden filled that political vacuum and is being the adult in the room. We need the others to put on their big boy pants and to take the right decisions right now and do it quickly. Thank you.
Fantastic, Yoni. I don't think anyone can top that. So I don't think I'll take any more questions, I'm afraid. But just to thank you all so much for an absolutely fascinating discussion. I could talk about this all afternoon, but I think we'll get slung out at some point. And really to say that, we at Chatham House, this is exactly what we want to sort of try and do, to recognize that these issues go beyond health. They are political. They are about power. And if we can act as some type of bridge between the technical people and CSOs and political leaders to sort of try and get these messages across in a way that they understand and they act on, then that's what we're here to do, really. So a blatant advertising pitch for Chatham House here, this is what we want to sort of try to do to relay these messages to political leaders. And also, I think thinking that we have seen that a number of universal health reforms have come out of crises like this. So looking to the future more optimistically, maybe this could, trigger UHC reforms in Nigeria, maybe the United States as well. Who knows? But, if we can help in that process, we'd be delighted to do so. So thank you so much for joining us today. And I hope we have a successful G20 summit, and look forward to joining you again to fight the next battles down the line. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.